Giants of the Faith podcast, where we look at influential Christians and their impact on Christendom and the world. My name is Robert Daniels, and I'm the host of this show, and this is episode 83, part 2 of our mini-series on Jacobus Arminius. This is the fourth episode in this season where we're drawing inspiration from InterVarsity Press's Biographical Dictionary of Evangelicals. Now, a friend of mine at church recently called me out for being so slow getting these episodes published, and all I can say is that I've been pretty busy at work and church, putting together a curriculum for a biblical archaeology class that I'm teaching, and a bunch of other stuff. So, Nathan, I'm sorry it's taken so long to get this episode out. Hopefully it's worth the wait. Today, we're continuing our look at Arminius by looking at the storms that followed his death. He died of tuberculosis in 1609, but of course his impact continued and continues long after his death. Specifically, today we're going to focus on the Synod of Dort, one of the most important and perhaps least understood events in the history of Christian doctrine. And we'll look at what Dort was, why it happened, and why Christians today, often unknowingly, are still living in the shadow of its decisions. When Arminius died in 1609, he left behind not just a theology, but a movement. His followers, known as the Remonstrants, were pastors, theologians, and lay people who believed that God's grace, though sovereign, was not irresistible, and that humans, enabled by grace, could respond freely of their own will and volition to his offer of salvation. In 1610, they presented their 5 Articles of Remonstrance, which is where they get their name, to the Dutch government. They wanted the government to convene a synod and recognize religious tolerance. These 5 points can be briefly summarized as: first, conditional election, where God elects those that he foreknows will believe. Second, universal atonement, that Christ died for all, though only believers benefit from his death. Third, human inability without grace, which is humans need divine grace to have faith. Fourth, resistible grace, God's grace can be resisted. And fifth, the possibility of apostasy, which says that true believers can and do fall away from the faith. So the Remonstrants didn't see themselves as calling on men to abandon Reformed doctrine, but rather to refine it, to correct what they saw as distortions of God's justice and love. Now, that viewpoint did not stop them from dividing the Dutch Reformed Church. Calvinists, also known as Contra-Remonstrants, led by theologians like Franciscus Gomarus, saw these ideas as a direct threat to Reformed orthodoxy and responded with strong opposition, insisting on unconditional election and irresistible grace. They called for their own synod to reaffirm Reformed theology, and tensions exploded into violence. In some towns, churches split. In others, ministers were driven out. The Remonstrants found support among more liberal and urban political leaders, including Johann von Oldenbarnevelt, sorry for the pronunciation, and the jurist Hugo Grotius, who favored religious tolerance. The Contra-Remonstrants were backed by more conservative rural elites and Prince Maurice of Orange, who saw the Remonstrants as a political threat and sought religious uniformity for national unity. The Dutch government, desperate for peace, called for a national synod, which is a church council, to resolve the controversy once and for all. Thus, the Synod of Dort convened on November 13, 1618, in the western Dutch town of Dordrecht, and ran until May 29, 1619. That was a massive event for the time and place. Over 100 theologians and church leaders from across Europe, including England, Scotland, Germany, and Switzerland, gathered in the city of Dordrecht. Over the 6 months of the synod, there were 180 sessions. The goal was simple but weighty: examine the Remonstrants' teachings and determine the official stance of the Reformed Church. The synod was led by Johannes Bogerman and was overseen by Maurice, which ensured that the outcome would be official and enforceable. Bogerman was a Frisian theologian, which just means he was from the coastal part of the Netherlands, and minister who was chosen as president of the synod. His role was decisive in shaping the outcome of the meetings. He oversaw the sessions, managed debates, and ensured that the discussions followed proper order. He often had to mediate between Dutch and foreign delegates from Reformed churches across Europe. Bogerman was a committed contra-remonstrant who was strongly opposed to the Arminians, and his leadership aligned with Prince Maurice of Nassau's political support for the Calvinist side, which gave him confidence and influence, and frankly, made the outcome of the Synod almost a foregone conclusion. Eventually, and as expected, the Synod formally endorsed the traditional Reformed doctrines, and Arminianism was condemned as heretical. Over 200 Remonstrance ministers were kicked out of office, and many of those were either imprisoned, exiled, or forced to flee. Van Oldenbarnevelt, the previously mentioned political protector of the Remonstrants, was arrested in August of 1618, 4 months before the Synod kicked off. His trial took place as the Synod of Dort was coming to an end, and he was convicted of treason, and on May 13th, 1619, he was executed by beheading. The Synod and Van Oldenbarnevelt's execution served to galvanize Maurice's political power. He forced the States General, which is the legislative assembly of the Dutch Republic, to disband militias across the provinces that had been raised to support and protect the Remonstrants. The National Army, which was already under Maurice's control, became the only military force in the Republic and further cemented his dominance. Politically, Dort ensured that the Dutch Republic would remain in the hands of the conservative Calvinists for the foreseeable future. So, the primary theological documents to come out of Dort are collectively known as the Canons of Dort. The canons are a response to the 5 articles of Remonstrance and are organized into 4 parts. It's from these 4 parts, when reorganized and split into 5, that we get the TULIP acronym so famously related to Reformed belief. Those 4 parts are, first, divine election and reprobation. God's election of the saved is unconditional, based solely on His will, not on foreseen faith or human merit. Second, Christ's death and human redemption. Christ's atonement is sufficient for all, but its saving effect is intended only for the elect. Third, human corruption and conversion to God. Humans are totally depraved, unable to turn to God on their own. And fourth, the perseverance of the saints. Those whom God has elected and regenerated will persevere in faith until the end. The canons, along with the earlier Heidelberg Catechism and Belgic Confession, form what is known as the 3 forms of unity among Reformed churches and believers, initially all across Europe, but eventually all over the world. These 3 forms of unity allow Reformed believers to have a common identity and give them a point of unity that transcends cultural and historical differences. They established the doctrinal identity of Reformed churches for centuries, continuing to this day. And at the same time that the Synod and canons brought unity to Reformed believers, they hardened divisions between the Reformed and other Protestants, like Lutherans and Arminians. These divisions still exist today. Just look online at any Christian forum. But the increasing secularization of society has helped to repair some of the broken bonds as Christians of all stripes stand together. Many Christians today, whether they realize it or not, are still living in the shadow of the Synod of Dort, because the theological decisions made there shape the very framework of how much of modern Protestantism understands salvation, grace, and human responsibility. It was convened to resolve the controversy between the followers of Arminius and the defenders of Calvinism, and its rulings gave birth to what we now summarize as the 5 points of Calvinism. And these doctrinal formulations, which I mentioned earlier, are commonly referred to using the acronym TULIP, are total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and the perseverance of the saints. They did not remain confined to the 17th century. They became foundational to Reformed and Presbyterian churches worldwide and have influenced Baptist, Methodist, and even modern evangelical discussions about free will and divine sovereignty. Even Christians who reject Calvinism are often reacting to categories and questions first crystallized at Dort, often without realizing their origin. Debates in today's churches about eternal security, predestination, human choice in salvation, and the assurance of faith are echoes of the struggles faced in that Dutch city over 400 years ago. In this way, the Synod of Dort continues to cast a long shadow, silently framing the conversations, sermons, and theological assumptions that believers inherit, whether they call themselves Calvinist, Arminian, or somewhere in between. Well, and that's it for today's episode. Again, I'm sorry this took so long to get to press. On the next episode, we'll briefly look at Arminianism today and its influence on the modern church. Thanks again for listening. Until next time, God bless.